Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today, inshallah, we shall begin our journey of surveying the kingdom fungi. As you recall from our previous discussion, we had divided this kingdom into four major categories of type of fungi, and they are listed here. What you will notice as we study these four categories is that their main distinction is how they produce their spores, or if they do. And their spore producing organs, they look distinctly different from one another. So there's this one. This is for the typical mushroom fungi that you and I appreciate. And look at this one, is a sac-like fungi. But today's discussion will be on the first category of the fungus that we shall be studying, the Zygomycotes. The term mycota usually refers to fungus. So these are four categories of fungus: the Zygomycotes, the Asexual, the Basidiomycotes, and Duromycotes. A fungus belonging to each of these categories is called, for example, Zygomycota, or Asexual, Basidiomycota, and Duromycota, and the category itself is called the Mycotes, Zygomycotes. So today, inshallah, we shall study the first again, the Zygomycotes, or the common bread mold, the mold that you see on bread, on stale bread that you would avoid. And the name of the common bread mold, which is a representative of this category of fungi, is Rhizopus stolonifer. So Rhizopus stolonifer, that's the official scientific name of the common bread mold. As you see, that's a scientific name where it is italicized and the genus is capitalized, the species is not capitalized. And if you were to write this with pen and writing, you would underline the scientific name and genus and the species. So if somebody were to look at up close to a bread mold, which I don't necessarily recommend except perhaps with a magnifying glass from a nice healthy distance, you would see something like this. And you would see that it seems like little thingies sticking up with a little kind of, little tiny blackheads over there on the top, and a kind of grassy feeling over there. And that's really an apt description of how the common bread mold appears. Now, this is a cartoon representation of the common bread mold. What you see over there as like the dandelion stalks type of things are the sporangia producing structures. Okay, so this is kind of like the most basic diagram of a bread mold. It has these stalk-like things on top of which they have like dandelion type of structures. They're not dandelion, they're more like spore-producing little pollen-producing type structures. Okay, of course, these are not pollen, but that's an analogy. So these are sporangial. They produce the spores that will give rise to other fungus. And these are the hyphae, and the sideways hyphae are called the stolons. This is not in English, I think it's like Spanish. This is sporangia, rhizoid, and stolons. Okay, I don't know, I think this might be Spanish slide. But anyway, they're called rhizoids and stolons and sporangia. So the ones that go sideways, those are stolons, and the ones that go deep down like roots are the rhizoids. One of the things that we have to appreciate, that this concept is a bit new for us, is that all the structures that you see before you here in this diagram are haploid structures. We're used to thinking like human beings, for example, every single cell in the human body, except for the sex organs, sperminate producing cells, all the cells are diploid. So most organisms, and including human beings, most of the cells are diploid. But what's different about this species, and you'll see this is not an uncommon phenomenon in nature, is that the majority of the organism is actually not diploid, it's actually haploid. And so is the case over here. What you see over here with the sporangia and rhizoids and the stolons, those hyphae and those spore-producing structures, they're all haploid. In other words, if you look at the nuclei in there, they have half the genome, they're half the nuclei. So when you look at the bread mold, the majority of the bread mold, in fact, is haploid. All the nuclei there are haploid. And the diploid are actually a very small percentage, so to speak, of this spore producing or mold. So now the life cycle of the mold is as follows. Okay, so what happens is these spore producing, they're going to produce spores, and they're going to land on over here, or maybe there's something else. There's a crouton or a croissant or whatever else, and an apple is close by. The spores then fly by and they land on adjacent areas. And if it's a habitable place where they can get food, the spores will germinate, okay? The spores will germinate. So the spores will give rise to hyphae called stolons, okay? The new spores will give rise to hyphae called stolons like this. They'll spread out like this, okay? And then some of these hyphae will give rise to the rhizoids, the roots of the spore, and then finally, and some hyphae will go upwards over here, and they'll produce the sporangia producing organs like that. Okay, so that's how the fungus grows. You know, starts out tiny, and then you'll see it grows, right? And sometimes you'll see, if you like in an orange that's decaying, then the different spots, because the other spots were sporangia spreading from the initial spot and landing over there to start a new colony, so to speak. Okay, so this is the basic structure of a bread mold. It has stolons that are sideways on the surface, and rhizoids, which are like roots, and then some of the hyphae give rise to sporangia. And sporangia produce spores, and they produce spores by asexual reproduction, by like mitosis type process. So there's no meiosis going on over here. All of this is N, and all of these are N structures, haploid structures. Okay. So they're just mitosing over there and giving rise to new spores. Now, it's these rhizoids, okay, that secrete the digestive juices over here that eat up the bread over time. And then by external digestion, they break up the food, and then they absorb the nutrients from the food. So these are the Zygomycotes, and the bread mold is a common example. Now here we see the stolons and the rhizoids, and this is grown enough that you can see. Now, as I was suggesting, now this colony here is a baby colony, right? As you can see, and it might have risen from a spore that originated from over there. And some of these hyphae, as I suggested, they go on to produce the sporangium structures. So the example that we have given here of the Zygomycotes is a Rhizopus stolonifer, which is the common bread mold, Rhizopus stolonifer. Now, Rhizopus stolonifer, they can produce spores of two different kinds, okay? The majority of the spores producing those dandelion type things that are growing over there, those are asexual type reproductions, okay? So but the Rhizopus is able to produce spores by two different methods. The other one is the secret method. I'm just kidding. We're going to talk about that next. So the first method is these spores that we see over here is asexual reproduction. The second type of spores that are formed results from sexual reproduction. The difference between asexual and sexual reproduction is in sexual reproduction there is a mixing of genetic material from two different sources. Okay, in other words, there's genetic material that fuses from two different fungi. Okay, so asexual reproduction, however, predominates over here, as I've suggested, as long as there's food around. So asexual reproduction, spores develop into sporangia. So that's the sporangia. Released, there are hundreds of other spores, and if they land on moist surface and there's food around, they develop into new hyphae. Okay, so they develop into new hyphae. All right, so but you have to understand, if there's a moist surface and if there is food around, okay, then there's a bread over here, and then that's what they're doing over here. So this is a sporangia, and sporangia are going to produce hundreds of spores. Okay, so you can see how they quickly can eat up that bread, and this is a higher magnification of the same thing. It's quite remarkable. Now, speaking of asexual reproduction, so here's asexual reproduction where they divide by mitosis and give rise to new spores and to germinate, etc. So what is sexual reproduction? Sexual reproduction, if you recall, is mixing of genetic material from two different fungi. Now look over here. There's one fungus over here, and it's different. They're not the same from the same source, okay? They're not from the same source. So what's going to happen is they're going to develop hyphae, one going this way, and there's a hyphae that's one going this way. Now, how do they know it come together? That's pretty complex, as you can imagine. They secrete little chemicals that attract each other like this. They come together, and they're going to fuse right here. Now, these are two different parent fungi. You follow what I'm saying? They're not connected to each other. They're not from the same original spore. So they're two different fungi. They come together. They grow these hyphae together, okay? Now, sexual reproduction occurs if unfavorable conditions exist. In other words, they're running out of bread, or the bread dries out, because the sporangia have to have a moist environment to live. So if the bread dries out, you can frequently see if the bread dries out, there's no mold on it, because they need to have water. They need to have a moist environment. So if such conditions exist, that means unfavorable conditions are present, then they will undergo a sexual reproduction, and they will produce very sturdy, thick-walled spores. They're called zygospores, okay? So they will produce these spores. So these are ordinary spores. When going gets tough, they will actually produce different kinds of spores called zygospores, okay? And they will be produced right here. They're not produced over there. They're not produced here. They're not produced here. The zygospores are produced right there, where the two hyphae meet. Okay, so this is how it happens. The haploid hyphae from compatible mycelia. Now, not just any fungus can come this way. They have to be compatible. Okay, one is called a positive, one is called a negative. Okay. In other words, no two molds can just come together and make zygospores. Okay, they have to be compatible. They have to be compatible strains. Okay, they fuse together and then they form a zygote. So let's take higher magnification of this area over here. So now they're coming together, the two mycelium, the hyphae. There's a +1 and a -1. Okay, that's how we know they're compatible. And once they come together, they go little buds like this, and the bud grows here, and the bud goes over this way, and they fuse. And they fuse together, and they form this little structure called gametangia. It's like a little gamete, okay? Now, look what happens over here. Once it forms, it walls itself out, okay? It walls itself out, this cell wall that forms like that, which grows into a rough and tough zygote, okay? And the zygote is then able to produce 2N nuclei, diploid nuclei. Now remember, all the nuclei that are over here, they're haploid. So some of the nuclei come over here, okay? But when they come over here, the nuclei actually fuse. They come together and give like fuse like this to give one big nuclei. So this is a haploid nuclei, and they give rise to two nuclei. It is the fusion of nuclei that is what's meant by sexual reproduction, okay? Two cells can come together without nuclei fusing. That's just fusing of two cells. But two cells can come together with the fusion of the nuclei. That's called sexual reproduction, okay? So what's happening here in the zygote is that the nuclei fuse. Now, when they fuse over here, now this is 2N, right? After they fuse, then they have more genetic material, then they divide by meiosis. Okay, now they give another N nuclei, haploid nuclei. But this haploid nuclei are going to be different from the original because there's mixing of genetic material. And if you recall from the process of meiosis, there's a great variability that's able to be generated from meiosis. So the new spores that are going to be produced from here are going to be different than before, and even though they're going to be haploid. So here's what's going to happen. So this is the zygote, and this is the fusion. As you can see, it's going to wall itself off, and this is a zygote. Okay. Now the zygote can lay dormant over there for a very long time. Okay. Remember, the zygote forms in unfavorable conditions, and it's tough. It's protected from drying out, protected from dying, etc. But in favorable conditions, it's going to sprout in new sporangia like that. Okay. Now, as you recall, like I said, all those nuclei are haploid, the ones that come together to give the diploid zygote. But then the diploid then undergoes meiosis to produce haploid spores, okay, to give haploid. So what's going on inside the zygote, when the time is right, it undergoes meiosis to produce new haploid nuclei. As I suggested, this haploid nucleus, the genetic material, is different. These are two distinctly different fungi. So this is a summary of the sexual reproductive process. So the hyphae, the plus, the mating type negative, mating type positive, meaning they're compatible but they're different. They come together and they fuse together, making the gametangia or gametes. And the nuclei over here, each one of these nuclei is going to fuse together to give the diploid nucleus over here. As you can see, it gives rise to many different diploid nuclei, okay, like that. And then they're going to undergo meiosis to produce sporangiospores. Sporangiospore is this thing that goes up there and makes the spores in the sporangium. So sporangium is the factory for spores. And over here already they're all N, and they go by mitosis. They would divide bigger and bigger and big, and they produce spores, and the spores can land and produce numerous other colonies of new fungi. So this is a summary of the life cycle of the common mold, the Rhizopus stolonifer common mold, as you can see here. Okay, so this is again a summary. This part of it is asexual reproduction simply by mitosis type process, right? And over here is with the nuclei fuse is sexual reproduction that occurs over here. And when those new spores are produced and they can make more fungi colonies. So that was our survey of the Zygomycotes, and we looked at representative fungus in this class, and that was the Rhizopus stolonifer, the common bread mold. Next time, inshallah, we shall talk about the next category, the Asexual mycotes. Until then, assalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Assalamu alaikum.